be now put.
I call Keith Locke.
Mr. Chairman, this is an interesting debate. Judith Collins, in her initial talk, said that criminals have to take responsibility for their crimes. And I think that's quite true. When we're talking about whether criminals are also victims, problems in their past, etc., that doesn't mean to say we say criminals shouldn't take responsibility for their crimes. But part of the process of stopping reoffending is to make them understand what they've done, make them understand and internalise what the horrible thing they've done to some other person, if it's a violent offence, to society. And that requires a whole process of rehabilitation, and that's where there is a link between people taking responsibility for their crimes and the fact that they may be in part also victims. And Clayton Cosgrove mentioned the case of someone who might be raped at age 5 and goes on later life at age 25 to be a sexual predator. Or it could be, as is often the case in our prisons, someone, if you look at our prisons, there's a very high rate of illiteracy. A lot of the people there have not, for one reason or another, have not learnt to read and speak very well, and tend to fall back in society, not get proper jobs, and tend to resolve matters with their fists rather than by discussion. And rehabilitation in prison often means linking the crime that they've committed with their past to some degree, and getting them to understand that even though they might feel that somehow they've got some grievance and some justification for doing what they do, that they don't really have that, and we can overcome their background together as part of the rehabilitation program. And some of the programs, David Garrett mentioned some programs in relation to drug cases which seem very good too. So I'm not saying there's a complete division in this House about how to go forward. And it's true, there's another comment that I think David Garrett made, that the prisoner must want to be rehabilitated. And that's true too. There's got to be some movement. But if you put up the 3 strikes thing, you're sort of saying to that person, you are the enemy, we're not giving you any slack, we're not really trying to understand you, you have no future. Sorry, I don't mean to refer to the chair in this case, who's a very good chair. That if you seem to be blocking off paths in the way this plays out, then you won't put people on the road to recovery. And also that question that the last speaker mentioned in terms of the amendment, that you want to have some incentive for people to plead guilty, because that process in and of itself becomes a recognition that they have some responsibility for their crime, can begin the program of rehabilitation in prison. If you give the incentives the other way for them to deny their criminality, to plead not guilty when they're clearly guilty, you're just, all you're doing is keeping them in prison forever, virtually, at a huge cost to society and at a huge cost to everyone. And to the extent that they do get out of prison, they're more likely to reoffend and create other victims, because they're so then anti the society, so unrehabilitated, and that's not a good solution.
Call Chris Hipkins.
Mr Chair, I want to know why the National Party are so keen to shut down debate on this bill before it's even gotten underway. Less than half an hour into the debate on this, with not one single National Party member taking a call on it, they've been trying to shut it down. Not one single National Party member, other than the Minister, trying to take a call on it, trying to shut it down. That's outrageous. And why is the National Party so afraid of actually debating this bill? It could be because the rhetoric doesn't live up, the reality, does not live up to the rhetoric that they have been making, that they have been putting forward. In fact, Mr Chairman, it's very easy for the National Party to screech as they are over there at the moment, the Labour Party's soft on crime, because we don't support this bill. We don't support this bill because it won't work. We will support things that actually do work. It is wrong to suggest that we're soft on crime, and in fact, the track record of the last few years would suggest otherwise. And some of the rhetoric that's been put forward to justify this bill just does not stand up to scrutiny. To claim, for example, that the Labour government didn't do anything to keep people in prison, keep the worst violent offenders in prison for longer, is simply not true. The new sentencing and parole laws that came into force in July 2004, for example, increased the minimum non-parole period for the worst murderers from 10 to 17 years. The worst offenders, the time that they have to wait between applications for parole has increased for up to 3 years. Instead of having the ability to apply automatically every year, automatic release at 2/3 of the sentence for serious violent offenders has been abolished, and the preventative detention is now available to keep the worst violent offenders, sexual and violent offenders, in prison for longer. So it's simply wrong to say that we haven't done anything to actually keep those offenders in prison for longer and make the public safer. The point the Labour members are making on this particular bill is that 3 strikes will not work. It will not work, and there are already other things available that can deal with many of the concerns that have been raised, and the National Party knows that, and that could well be why they're not actually willing to debate this particular bill, and they're more interested in closing it down. I want to turn to the regulatory impact statement of the bill, because I think that raises a number of legitimate concerns. This is the government's own regulatory impact statement, and it found, for example, in public safety, that it's not possible to conclude with any certainty the extent to what extent any of these options will improve public safety, and there's a possibility that removing the worst repeat violent offenders from the community for longer periods of time will result in less serious violent offending. However, offenders who commit serious violent offences do not necessarily have previous serious sentences for serious violent offences. So surely that's where the debate should be at. It should be at how do we make the community safer? How do we actually crack down on serious violent offending before it takes place? What are the key causes of serious violent offending, and how can we address those? And we're not hearing anything from the government about what they're doing on that. Public confidence in the criminal justice system could actually be undermined by this legislation. This is the regulatory impact statement that argues this, that public confidence could be undermined if the worst repeat offenders policy raises the potential for disproportionate outcomes which may negatively affect public confidence in the criminal justice system. So actually, it's really important that the public have confidence that the criminal justice system is netting out a punishment that is fair and proportionate. And if it's not, the public confidence in the system will be eroded, and that has to be to the detriment of everybody. Most research has found, this is again from the regulatory impact statement, has found that imprisonment has little, if any, specific deterrent effect. There is a great deal of evidence indicating that offending rates decrease only marginally as a result of penalties being increased. Now, this is the regulatory impact statement that states that. That's not my claim. That's what the regulatory impact statement argues. So here we've got the government putting forward saying, well, actually we're going to deter repeat offending. I would suggest that if somebody's already on their second strike, the knowledge that they're going to go away from prison for a lot longer isn't necessarily going to act as a deterrent. One would think that the sentences that were available on the first and second strike would have acted as a deterrent. There are obviously other factors at play here that we need to deal with. This bill does nothing to address those. Looking at the financial cost, both the life without parole and the worst repeat violent offender policies represent a small but gradually increasing transfer of cost within the funding available, Mr Chair,
Chris Hipkins.
Within the funding available to the justice sector, from the detention and prevention of offending to the detention of offenders who may, particularly once they're elderly, pose no risk to the public. Surely we should be focusing the resources on the detention and prevention of offending as much as we are. Sandra Gowdy says that's boring. Well, I say to Sandra Gowdy, I'd much rather prevent the crime in the first place, prevent the creation of victims in the first place, than have an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff to deal with the criminal offenders once they've already committed their crimes. I would rather have fewer victims in the first place, and Sandra Gowdy seems to think that's boring. I think that's an absolute disgrace, and that highlights the position of the National Party. They're not interested in preventing crime in the first place. They're more interested in punishment and retribution after the fact. That does nothing